Okay, a very warm welcome, everyone. Hello, Maya, good to see you.
Hi, good to see
And,
you.
I can't think of a better time to have the kind of discussion that we are having now. You know, we are all caught in this, subjected to this barrage of misinformation that gets thrown at us all the time, misinformation masquerading as facts. And some of this we invite, because we're all caught up in this WhatsApp whirlwind, starting from the first thing in the morning through the day.
Mm,
And I mean, some of this is, of course, chit chat, old college school friends, and a bit of gupshup, some happy nonsense.
yeah.
But much of it is political. And that which is political is fine if someone's expressing a view. But if someone is distorting something with a view to converting you, even recruiting you, then of course we have a problem. And of course we have a right to not be manipulated in this manner. And I really can't think of a more suited panel of individuals who can speak to us today on this than people who've joined us and joined this discussion now. Um, Lyric Jain from Logically will be with us very soon. We have Saurabh Shukla here from News Mobile, and his group has done a lot of fact checking, something like 2,000 and more instances of this. And Saurabh is also a very well known established journalist, a familiar commentator. He has reported from, other than India, of course, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sudan, Nigeria. I don't know many Indian journalists who have done all that. And we need, of course, to hear from established media. Maya Mirchandani is someone many of us are familiar with. Her extensive and incisive work at NDTV, particularly in areas of foreign policy. You were the foreign affairs editor, and now with the Observer Research Foundation. Also, from the more established media, of course, distinctions between established and the new web-based media are getting quite blurred. But we have Kritika Goyal from Quint, and she leads their initiative on fact-checking. And also her work has led to about 2,000 investigations. So if Saurabh is doing that many and Kritika, you are doing that many, I mean, what's going on around us? And of course, there are issues then fundamental to all this on policy. And what should be the policy? What is the legal recourse? And analyzing this, taking a very good look at all this, we have Amber Sinha from the Center for Internet and Society, and he's author of The Networked Public. He has been looking at policy issues around misinformation and looking at what can be done about it, not ideally, but in a practical, functional way. And so this is just a bit of a taster. I'm not here to speak for you, of course. We will hear from you. And sort of a quick word from you on your work with this investigation on facts. Tell us what you did.
So, essentially, Sanjay, thank you so much for your introduction and great to be on this panel. Essentially, when we select a fact check, what we have in mind is that we have the public interest in mind. If there is a chance that it may lead to a communal tension, it may lead to somebody dying, it can lead to tension between communities. That is something which is the paramount importance, because then we have a fact check committee which takes a call, which one to prioritize, because there are so many instances that are reported to us by our readers, viewers. We also work now very closely with Facebook and WhatsApp. We've just launched a bot with WhatsApp to report misinformation. So that works, that is working very well, essentially. And, we've been doing a lot of COVID misinformation because, again, this impacts people. So any fact check where we see that it impacts people, we will go ahead and do it, because I believe that today people need to understand, in this era of social media, there's so much of misinformation that is going around. Sharing is so easy. Often people, in fact, a lot of times, even people who are very well-read, people who are celebrities, people who hold powerful positions, they end up either sharing fake news. That's the reason why the role of fact checkers like News Mobile becomes even more important. And I think it's a work in progress, but I'm very glad that our team has been working hard to bust these fact checks. We've got global appreciation. BBC profile, got us on one of the our work during the Indian elections. So I think it's a work in progress, but I'm very happy that the way we have been going about fact checking, and obviously we are trying to now introduce, besides editorial expertise that we have, to collaborate with organizations like Logically to even get AI-driven fact-checking expertise. Sanjay.
Right. Amber, we are looking at initiatives like what we've heard, we've seen what Saurabh is doing, we see what Logically is doing. But is this going to be for individuals and their organizations with initiative and expertise to counter this? Or really, does the government need to do something? Do we need policy? Do we need laws? Do we need regulation here?
I think thanks for that question, Sanjay. The scope of the problem of misinformation and also related extreme speech that we see, particularly on online platform, and then I think in the more recent past, what we've also seen is that traditional news media sources picking up similar kinds of information. And I think over the last year, there have been several sort of war room set up in news media organizations focusing on fact checking. Despite that, we do see a lot of proliferation of that fake news as well as extreme speech content on social media platforms, and then the flow of that content also to traditional news media outlets. So the scale of the problem is such that that there will be a wide we need sort of to look at it more holistically in terms of different kinds of regulatory challenges that it poses. And while a lot of focus is on fact checking at the moment, which is obviously core to the problem, what we'll also need to recognize is that there needs to be other kinds of more holistic solutions also that we need to think of, and also in that sense, involvement of different stakeholders. So fact checking in some senses assumes that once you have corrected a particular piece of fake news, the impact of that fake news is nullified, which is not the case. Because there is, all the research that we see around it seems to suggest that it is not as if the way in which fake news or extreme speech is also targeted, it uses certain kind of social context, it uses certain kinds of biases that already exist within the demographics where it is targeted. And then it, in that sense, amplifies those biases, amplifies certain kinds of social skills that exist. So similarly, by then bringing in information which fact checks that, doesn't quite address the larger scope of the problem as well as the impact of fake news. And then the problem where it sort of originates, which is at the point of internet intermediaries and social media regulations. And currently the way it works is that social media companies enjoy something called a safe harbor, where they are not held responsible for the content on their platforms because that content is not created by them. However, and so in some senses, the regulatory metaphor that we use is that they are merely dumb conduits through which information flows. So they don't hold responsibility for that. However, the nature of algorithmic filtering and prioritizing of information that most social media companies engage in at this point of time, that metaphor just doesn't quite work anymore. There is a fair of role that they play in terms of determining what kind of content individually every user would see and what kind of user experience they would have. And
yes, but there's a question here about regulation. I mean, how do you regulate this? Who checks this? And of course, in established media, what used to be called established media, and Maya can tell us a little more about this, as of course will Kritika, you have the assumption that these are institutions where journalists have gone through some training. There are internal checks, and there is a individual discipline and a institutionalized discipline, a system of fact checking. Now, there is a question if established media itself, becomes susceptible or is inclined to join some of these dubious bandwagons, then where is the standard that others are deviating from? Then what is the hope? And Maya, you've been engaged in this work on all sides, the established media, and now through the Observer Research Foundation, you are researching the issue of misinformation, particularly in policy matters. Tell us, do you think that this needs external regulation? Does it need more internal discipline? And what do you do with the in-between space?
So, Sanjay, I'll take the last bit of your question first. Thank you all for having me, first of all, on this this great panel. I'm a huge fan of Ambar's work, and the Network Public is part of essential reading that I give to my students at Ashoka University, where I teach media studies as well. So, I mean, I urge everyone on this panel to also read Ambar's work on this. I just want to say a couple of things. One is, you know, it's a very slippery slope when we talk about regulation, because regulation, top-down regulation is in danger of being manipulated by government, by whoever is in power in that day and of the day. Do we want to invest that kind of authority and control in a group of people or a government where you know, things can be manipulated? And I think the answer to that is a resounding no. By the same token, given that the information space has been democratized now by social media, do we want tech platforms and social media to have control over what is said and what is not? I mean, they have broad community standards, and we can talk about that later. But the answer to that also is no, because social media companies are sort of driven by the profit motive. Newsrooms, Sanjay, as you pointed out, I mean, across the world are struggling with how to kind of keep pace with a few different pulls and pressures. One is, of course, who's willing to pay for good journalism? And the answer is increasingly a very small number of people. Maybe the pandemic has changed that to some degree, but you know, the fact that there's so much information freely and fast flowing on social media means people feel that they've got the information in any case, and it's from people they trust. They might be in their circle of interaction, and so it doesn't matter what a journalist is saying. The other aspect of this is that across the world, you're seeing political groupings essentially also discredit newsrooms that have been questioning or critical or contrary. And so that purpose of discrediting brings me to really what I wanted to kind of lay out for this panel, which is that, I mean, at the outset, I want to say that I find fake news, the term fake news, extremely problematic, for the simple reason that if I mean, you know, we've seen President Trump, for example, call the New York Times fake news or call the Washington Post fake news. Anything that he doesn't like is termed fake news. And it became a very easy term for people to just kind of latch onto. But the truth of the matter is we're dealing with a very, very complicated landscape of information where a lot of information is weaponized. I mean, let's just understand one thing, that rumor, propaganda, neither of these two things are particularly new. Why is it a problem today? And it's a problem today fundamentally, A, because the tech platforms have changed the information landscape, because there is an amplification through these platforms. I mean, the speed and volume that we cannot imagine control of. There's an automation. We've seen bots do half the work, you know, to kind of amplify a particular message. And the fact that you have algorithms that pick up what your preferences might be and kind of keep pumping you with more of that information, which is what we saw happen during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example. But weaponized information is not just really about making political choices. It's driven largely by political choices. But I feel that this information disorder or infodemic or whatever you want to call it today is sort of a conglomeration of weaponized information, where you have misinformation, which is sort of, you know, it could be deliberate, it need not be deliberate. It's just sometimes incorrect, unverifiable information that may be true, but misarranged. You have disinformation, which I feel is really the bigger problem of the two, which is a deliberate campaign to send falsehoods into the information space, amplify them enough where, you know, you tell a lie enough times and the lie becomes the truth. That's really what we're actually working on. And all this feeds on, like I said, fear, insecurity, grievance. So you find an enemy, you target that enemy, and that morphs into hate speech. You might have community standards, but at the end of the day, I think we're looking at a societal problem that goes beyond technology.
Yes, and Kritika at Quint, you've been working on exactly the kind of thing that Maya has been describing. Tell us, what is this kind of fact checking you've done over the past 3 years? And you've run into these thousands, a couple of thousand cases that you investigated. I mean, for a start, does this mean that catching out a non-story, catching out a non-fact has become now a story in itself? Is this so widespread, is it so pervasive that simply catching out the lies has become a task in itself? Tell us a little more about what you've done.
So yeah, I think I do agree with the fact that catching the lie has really become a task in itself because of the kind of misinformation and disinformation which is being spread on social media platforms. And also the fact that these days, a lot of misinformation that we see is on WhatsApp. And in fact, according to a study which was recently published, it shows that the trust level is really high when you receive something on WhatsApp. And that's maybe because you're receiving it from a group of people or an individual that you know personally. So you tend to believe in something which might not be true. And I think another reason for it is also confirmation bias, something that you have believed in for so long. And after that, somebody tells you whatever you've believed in is true, then it sort of confirms whatever belief you've had. So I think those are two reasons why there is so much of misinformation and why people are also sort of falling for that misinformation or misinformation actually that they receive on various social media platforms.
Give us an example. Give us an example of what you did.
Yeah, so the kind of work that we've been doing is so I think in the last 1 year, starting from Pulwama attacks, if I can give that example. There was Pulwama attack, then there were Balakot airstrike, which happened. Then there was Article 370, abrogation of Article 370, which happened. Then there were anti-CAA protests, there were Northeast Delhi violence, and now the pandemic. So all of these news events, we've seen a lot of misinformation, and one common pattern or narrative that we have generally seen around all of these news events is communal hatred. Even during the pandemic, we have seen, now if I could give you an example, even during the pandemic, after the Tablighi Jamaat event happened in Delhi, we saw that the misinformation or the kind of information that we were seeing around the pandemic really took a communal turn. Initially, we saw a lot of cure related misinformation. We saw symptoms misinformation. But after that event, we saw a lot of misinformation, which was communal in nature. So I think that is one common thread or one common narrative that I have observed in the last 1.5 years, 16 months, 17 months, which is really persistent, I think.
Yes. Amber, there is a question here, isn't it, arising from what Kritika is telling us and what Maya is saying. Well, you have the Pulwama attack and we have misinformation. Some of this, and as Maya said, propaganda itself is not new. I mean, it's always been a weapon of war. Therefore, if you are looking at distortion, that is deliberate. If some of that distortion is nationally fed, it suits the government of the day, then who is going to legislate? Because legislation will be national by definition, unless you're going to have a global agreement, which seems not likely at all. So if it comes to Pulwama, then the Pakistani government will have one interest in putting out some kind of information on WhatsApp groups and other platforms. The Indian government will have another interest. So who legislates and how?
What you need to look at is there are certain kinds of internationally recognized principles, right? So there is the principle of free speech, and how the right to free speech, for instance, is then tailored by looking at complicated examples of hate speech and misinformation. So the kind of regulatory setup that is needed here is at one level, I think there has to be a recognition of first principles of free speech, first principles of how to look at instances of misinformation, disinformation, as Maya put it, and as well as things like online harassment and free speech, which also play a strong role in the nature of sort of weaponized information that we see online. And then there has to be a very, very clear expectation of different stakeholders. So if we map the stakeholders here, there are internet intermediaries, such as social media companies, for instance, who carry, who have become the primary source of consumption for a lot of users, for instance. Then they need to have very clear responsibilities based on the primary legislation that the government sets up. And based on that, they must have rule-making responsibilities, because right now they are the bodies. They're essentially in a self-regulatory framework, right? They frame their own community guidelines, they frame the rules. And to what extent, in what ways those rules must be framed, there is not much to hold them accountable. Yes, there is a Shreya Singhal judgment in India, which sets out certain conditions for how takedown of content must be looked at. But broadly, they still operate in a state of relative regulatory vacuum. So you need primary legislation to create first principles, and then that legislation must be instructive on how different stakeholders then react with it. And then, for instance, again, if we have to look at self-regulatory frameworks which exist with respect to traditional news media, then how that needs to be reinvented to look at the fake news problem. So
but are we approaching any of these things? I mean, there's a need for this, and this is the direction it should take, but do you see any movement in that direction?
So there has been an ongoing discussion for a long time now to amend the intermediary liability rules. However, the most recent public version of the rules that we have seen from the Ministry of Electronics and IT leaves a lot to be desired, in that the impact of those kinds of rules, where it puts the responsibility entirely on the intermediaries. The response of the intermediaries then would be to take a very anti-free speech position, where they would remove content at the slightest provocation. So there has to be a clear balance where you frame regulation. So like Maya mentioned, that the important thing that we have to look at is that these platforms also allow certain kind of democratization of speech. They allow amplification of voices, which hitherto was controlled by a much tighter unit. And that is, and what kind of impact does regulation have on that is also something that we need to be very clear about.
Yes. Meanwhile, we have a question here for the panel from Shailesh Chandra. He wants to know, what are the tools to fight fake news? And I know, Maya, you're quite right to say that that expression itself has been made rather dubious through its use by Trump. But we are speaking of fake news as distorted, incorrect information put out to suit
Right.
some interest and to manipulate us. So please, let's do respond to this question from Shailesh.
Sanjay, just two quick ones, I think, which I always advise people when they write to us, is Google reverse image search. There's a video tool called InVid. Tools like these, you go to a search engine, check the veracity, also check if you see a picture, for instance, see if there is a vehicle in the picture, check the number plate, where is this, number plate from. So, a lot of things, if you remember, we all did it like a kid. I used to love making those jigsaws and, spot the difference kind of a thing. If you've been doing it and you're a smart reader with some of these tools, you can really find out by yourself whether this story is, Maya, I hate to use the word fake or not, or it's true or not.
Right. I mean, if I can just add to that, a lot of what is fake or misinformation or disinformation, it sort of mimics real, genuine news. And I think that's really the struggle, that to a layperson, when you're receiving something, a link on WhatsApp, or I'll give you an example. My father sent me a video today about how the US is sending, military support to India to fight China. And I'm still trying to find out the source of this video because I've not seen it anywhere else. And as I went through the end, I thought there'll be a credit, there'll be somebody who's made the video. It says, please subscribe, but it doesn't tell me who to subscribe to. So the first thing I did was ask my father, where did you get this? And he said, oh, a friend sent it to me. So I said, okay, I don't mean where did you personally get it? I mean, do you know if this has been produced anywhere? And his response was, when you find out, let me know. So, I mean, I think the fact that it looks like it could be actually a genuine piece of news. And this brings us to a whole different conversation on deepfake technologies and stuff like that. But what I tell people is look at the headline. Very simple, reverse images and reverse search image technology in Google and stuff. It's very simple to do, but there's a lot, like my parents will not do it. I know that they won't. So
Sure.
the thing is, I tell them, look at the headline. Is it all caps? Are there 5 exclamation marks? Are there 3 question marks? Who's the person who's written the story? Have you heard their name before? What is this website? And a classic example of this was during the early days of the pandemic, or at least the early days in India. There was a story that said Tom Hanks had died of COVID. Yeah. And it was viral, and suddenly it turned out to be fake news, or deliberate disinformation. So it was exactly this: screaming headlines, exclamation marks, a site that you cannot really find any other information about, a journalist who is not really a journalist because they don't exist. So there are these small little ways of doing it without actually looking at other tools. Because I'll tell you, the biggest sort of audience for this kind of information is an elderly audience in India right now. I mean, you've got a lot of senior citizens on family WhatsApp groups, on neighborhood RWA WhatsApp groups, who are exchanging messages all the time. I call out my RWA on a daily basis saying, where did you get this?
I mean, theoretically, we would need 1.3 billion investigative journalists in India to stop this.
Exactly.
Or whatever adult percentage of that is active on this media. But those are questions that are very difficult, I think, for people to ask. People don't have the training to look out for the kind of things, Maya, that you describe. It's not just your parents, it's people all around us. And surely there is a problem, and this is what a lot of people tap into. We would like to believe what we want to believe. And if we believe that, well, suddenly there's plane loads of hardware arriving from the US for fighting away China, then we will say, yes, this is true. But going back to Sailesh's question again, and Kritika, you've been working with this very actively. Tell us, through your experience, what are the tools, as he asks, for fighting all this? One tool is, of course, what you do. You investigate, you find something to be fake and false, and you publish. But you publish only to the extent that you have viewers and readers. How do you circulate it? How do you fight this?
So I think one advantage that we have is that we have the Quint's audience, because Quint is also a news organization. So we definitely rely on that audience to put out our fact check stories. And also, I think the second thing is a lot of information we're receiving on WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp tip line number where we receive these stories from our readers and our viewers. So we send it back to them on WhatsApp. So I think that is one thing what we are trying to do, to send the information, the correct information back to the platform where we're receiving it from. So of course, other than sharing it just on Twitter or Facebook and other Instagram and other platforms, we're trying to send it back on WhatsApp to the users who send it, so that probably if they find that the information we've given is verified, the information that we've given to them, because we're not giving opinions, we're giving them facts, and we're giving them facts based on something which is there. We're not relying on dubious sources, or we're not relying on hearsay to tell people that what we are doing is a fact check. We're just relying on facts to tell them that this is how we know we fact check this. And I just wanted to add one more point about the tools. Although Saurabh sir and Maya ma'am, they've very appropriately said everything, but I just want to add one very little thing, that a lot of times we receive old articles, like let's say something which was published 8 years ago. It was relevant at that time, but now when you're circulating it today without any context, it might look like, oh, it has happened right now. But no, it didn't happen now. It happened 8 years ago. So I think that is also one thing which probably people can look at while they're sending something, if they want to check it on their own. I think that's one thing. They can just look at the timeline, they can just, look at the dateline, and they can see when the story was published. So that's just one more point I wanted to add.
Yes, yes. But again, in this roller coaster rush of looking at this, looking at that, glancing at this, picking what you choose, And of course, we have so much thrown at us that in simply selecting to read what we do, we are expressing our own bias too. So it's a matching and a blending of bias from the sender and the receiver. That is a part of the problem. And that is certainly a tough one. But we have a question again from now Tom Aditya. And he says that media and itself needs to answer a question. There are motivated plants from both the left and the right of the political spectrum, and that mainstream newspapers and news outlets are themselves biased and exhibiting bias. And I know we did flag this question a little earlier on. If what we call mainstream media, which is allegedly or expected to be setting the standard, is itself biased, then when we are looking at fact checking, and somebody like Kritika can research and Saurabh can research, but typically people will say, okay, we've heard this, but does the newspaper say this? Is it in the TV news today? If that standard itself becomes shaky, then there is a further question. And Amber, do tell us, when you research this, do you see this divide or duality, tension between the new media and established media? And where does a sense of responsibility sit as you see it?
I think we should disabuse ourselves of the notion that there is anything called a neutral sort of carrier of information. The medium of information plays in many, many different ways. It plays a strong role in determining the nature of that information, and then in some cases also who consumes it or how important or how it is prioritized. I think if a news media outlet has a clear ideological position, it is fine for it to have that. What is problematic is when that ideological position starts dictating its reportage in ways where you have selective emphasis on information in a way that doesn't give a comprehensive account of the facts, where you actually, even in cases where you may not have positioned, where you may not have fake or misinformation as part of your reportage, if there is a clear and sort of clear attempt on the part of the news media to selectively emphasize only on pieces of information that hides the true picture from its users, I think that becomes problematic.
Yes.
And then in cases you might have misinterpretation of content also, particularly in areas where reportage requires technical sort of analysis. For instance, if you have reportage of legal cases, reportage of technology, that often requires a certain degree of nuance and understanding of the subject matter, which sometimes unintentionally you may not be able to provide in sort of real time when you're reporting on issues, which I think is perfectly fine. But I think those mistakes can be corrected as you go along. But I think while it is okay to have that ideological bias, the problem is when that ideological bias translates into one portraying news which is patently false, or where there is a very, very clear, blatant attempt to only selectively focus on a part of that news information and not give a sort of clear picture.
Yes, Saurabh, you've been actively engaged in this from all sides. Your thoughts?
I would agree with Amber on this. And I would say that, it's a dilemma of sorts. If you ask me as a fact checker, as I said, that we largely focus on public interest issues. So for us, we believe that, and I can tell you the system that we have evolved after several years, so to say, is one to have like an editorial board which takes a call on which is the more important fact check for you. It doesn't matter where this comes from. If there's a misinformation, if for instance there's a misinformation on, say, Tablighi Jamaat doing something, if it's coming from the right wing, we will fact check that. If there is a misinformation coming from a centrist or a leftist group against rightist, and if this is not correct, we will fact check that as well. But largely when I say public interest, we are more of issues that impact people. So whether it's an issue of migrant workers, whether it's an issue of a pandemic, or health misinformation where people's lives, as I mentioned, communal, riots was a major one. In fact, and also I want to add here, since we've been talking about established outlets, I'll give you an example. We did a fact check, which became fairly popular. Actually, we fact checked one of the leading national newspapers in India, which actually put out a fake news. And again, a news item saying that a certain hospital in a leading locality has been shut because of COVID cases. Now, what would this mean? That meant that a lot of critically ill patients who would have actually used that hospital couldn't do that because this piece of information, and since it went out on a national newspaper, obviously they had much more number of subscribers and users. It went viral. So what we did was old school journalism. Get to the primary source. We went to the district authorities. We did a double check from the police. We also then went to the hospital management, got them to actually supply us real time that no, this hospital has not been shut. It's a false news. And we published that. And what happened was then the national newspaper, obviously, since we had done a strike, they appealed to us. They corrected the news stories. So what I'm trying to explain to you is that sometimes the public interest supersedes some of the other stories that have been doing rounds. And obviously, as a fact checker, you have to take that priority. So we have a established editorial board of senior fact checkers who take a call that this is a priority story for us. And then we fact check that story. And as I said, that for us, it doesn't really matter. We have done stories, fact check stories, both on the right-wing groups, on some of the other groups. So, that's the way we try to maintain a balance.
Yes, and
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, Maya, in fact, I was going to suggest that you tell us a little more about this, because on this tension between what is established media and the new social media, you, I'm sure, have some things to share. And we have, meanwhile, a question from Resham Singh Sandhu, who says that newspapers and established media broadly does need to be more responsible, particularly, he says, in rural India. There is a difficulty because a lot of people can get misled more easily than might some others. Whether that's true or an assumption, who's to say, but this is what he has written in to say. So do consider this when you speak to us, Maya, please.
Right. So just a couple of things, and I think it'll address the question that's been asked as well. One part of the answer is an introspective one. And I think that overall, there does need to be a fair amount of introspection across various media and media technologies of the blurring of lines between news and opinion. When you have, for example, a senior politician or a member of a political party writing an op-ed in the papers, is that an op-ed? Should that be just a press release from the political party? Because they are assuming that they're presenting their party's political position. Why is it being presented as opinion or analysis? It is a political position. That's one part of it. The second is the sort of nature of primetime TV debates and pitting one person against the other, and the so-called anchor moderator trying to maintain a balance by giving people equal time. I mean, I think as Amber pointed out, this issue of equal time and neutrality, we need to do away with that. And I'll give you an example of what I mean about that. When we looked, I think it was in 2017, when we had, in August 2017, when there was an exodus of Rohingya after the genocide in Myanmar into Cox's Bazar and then coming over into India. And we saw the kind of ratcheting up, and this points to what Kritika was talking about, how there is an overwhelming skew in the kind of speech against the Muslim community. And I think we need to be honest about confronting that reality. So it's all very well to say that it doesn't matter if it's left or right or center or whatever, and that's true. There is fake news and misinformation all around, but there is a skew against a particular community when it comes to targeted misinformation, targeted hate speech, and targeted disinformation. So when the Rohingya exodus happened, you suddenly had concerns about national security being raised because there was talk about how ISIS was recruiting in Rohingya camps. All this is true. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying these things didn't happen. But Was the humanitarian crisis real and staring at you in the face at that point in time? Was it a bigger crisis? Was it fair for the mainstream media to give equal space to a national security argument which existed in a hypothetical space than to a humanitarian story which was happening in real time? And I think, you know, that's a question on us. It's on our conscience. And we don't have an answer. I mean, if you ask me, I'm very clear that yes, the two stories are stories, and you have government spokespeople articulating one point of the story, but it cannot be at the cost of humanitarian concerns. I mean, first and foremost, journalism is considered a public good, verifiable. We all went to university. We all learned the tools of the craft. We learned what it meant to second source information. We learned what it meant to go to the field. As Saurabh said, they did old-fashioned journalism. They went to the field. They went to the primary source. I mean, why is that fact-checking today? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves.
Yes.
Why is that not just journalism?
Yes, which is really the heart of the problem. If a journalism which is expected to be disciplined is itself less than that and is itself compromised, then what do you check facts against? It's very difficult for an individual to have some, WhatsApp message thrown at them, backed by a number of people, and then or something on FB which has had 1 million posts and more, to then start investigating this. But Kritika, through your work, and looking at this question of where the facts sit and how do you check them, do you find that established media, and I say that within single quotes, is considerably more reliable still than what you see on social media? And when you see that there is a distortion that you investigate, what is it that people can do on their own without having to rely on you? And that's not a rude suggestion at all. What is it that people can do? And we have a question here from Vidisha Chatterjee saying, among other things, what could WhatsApp do? And you spoke of WhatsApp as a principal channel for such distortion.
So I think one thing which is really important sometimes is to go to the source of the information. As we're talking about media outlets also sometimes publishing information which isn't always correct, I just have an example at the top of my head, which is something which I saw in August last year when Article 370 was abrogated. There was an op-ed which appeared in a very reputed newspaper, which said that B.R. Ambedkar was against Article 370. So whatever has happened is basically, B.R. Ambedkar would have been happy today if he would have been alive. But the truth of the matter is, if you go through his speeches, if you go through all the documented speeches and everything that he has given in the parliament or elsewhere, which is very well available on the Ministry of External Affairs website, you don't really find any evidence of that sort. So my question is, where is that argument coming from? So in fact, when we were trying to find out what the source of that information was, we found out it was somebody who had made up, I mean, I can't say it was a made up quote or not, but somebody said it was an internal conversation that they had with Ambedkar. But there is no source of that information. Anybody can or cannot make that. So I think that is one thing which is important, is to go to the source of the information. I understand as readers or as viewers, we might not always have that kind of time, or we might not always have that, we might not really always want to go through all of those logs or volumes of 14 volumes which are there on External Affairs website. But I think that is really, for me, it's really, really important to go to the source of the information and find out where is it coming from. That is, I think, one thing. The other thing that we are talking about is WhatsApp. I think with WhatsApp, the problem is it's end-to-end encryption, because it's a messaging app which is end-to-end is encrypted. It becomes very difficult to sometimes see the kind of misinformation which is being shared in closed network. The reason why we are able to see the kind of misinformation on WhatsApp is also because of our readers, because of the people who are sending us tip-offs, and because of the Webkoof tip line number that we have. So I think with WhatsApp, it becomes really difficult to fight misinformation also because it's end-to-end encrypted. And I think another place where I feel there is a lot of misinformation, but we've still not been probably able to find out the right solution for it, is these closed groups on Facebook. These closed groups on Facebook also have a lot of misinformation, which probably it becomes difficult for us as fact checkers or as journalists to always fact check or clarify, because that information is something we're not able to see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like,
Sanjay, if I can make a small point to add to what Kritika is saying. I mean, if you remember in 2018, when we had those incidents of lynching in Karnataka that had taken place, the government had actually summoned WhatsApp and asked them what they were doing about it. It was interesting that they chose the incident of lynchings of child abductors and not anybody else when they did that. But we leave that aside. WhatsApp decided at that point in time that they were going to limit the number of times you could forward a message, that there was going to be a marker on the message that it said it was a forward. And I do think that step actually made people a little more alert about what they were sharing. I'm not saying it's foolproof or it was 100%, but I know that there is enough evidence to indicate that for some people, the fact that the message that they received said it was forwarded gave them the sort of information that told them, okay, the person who's sending it to me is not the source of the message. So if they've sent it, it may be true, but it's not their message. Now you get, forwarded as received, a kind of caveat as well that comes along with these messages. And again, now in the course of the pandemic, they restricted that forward to one. I mean, they keep moving back and forth. You can forward something one time, or you can send it 4 times or 5 times. So, things like that happen. On Facebook and the closed groups that Kritika is talking about, here, I think this is Amber's area as well. I mean, it's one thing to have artificial intelligence and machine learning tools that are doing pixel recognition, and you're putting in keywords into systems, which is bringing down these messages. Ultimately, it's upon them to actually, have human moderation. I mean, messages and posts and profiles are suspended and brought down, but who's actually checking that to see if there was merit in that or not?
I want to just add here, Sanjay. Can I just add quickly to what Maya said? I completely agree with her that algorithms alone cannot check this. They have while some of the platforms have done, like Facebook has a third-party fact-checking program, which Newsmobile and Quint is part of. But I think more needs to be done, because there is so much. The volume of misinformation is so large, that you need not only platforms investing more, but I saw one of the comments in one of the readers, philanthropic organizations also need to come, because if I have to deploy the last mile journalists, the last mile fact checkers on the ground, you need all the more support from organizations who are unbiased and who are also supporting that cause, because that's very important. And I would say fact checking today is really the investigative journalism as it should exist today. That's a real existing journalism. That's what I call the investigative journalism of today, is fact checking.
Yes, there's a quick question though arising from Kritika, what you say, and also from one of the questions that has come in is, could WhatsApp itself do more? And Amber would like to hear from you on this, because this is an important regulatory issue, I believe. Can WhatsApp itself do at least offer some general guidelines across its very huge database of users to instruct people on what to watch out for, the kind of experiences that Kritika is describing, that Saurabh is describing, that there is something WhatsApp itself and FB itself can do, that, what could they do? And could this be voluntarily introduced, or could it be regulated? What is the way out?
So if I may come in quickly on that question. So in terms of what are the kinds of things that WhatsApp can do to combat misinformation on its platform, there are different levels at which we can look at their role, and each of them have their own problems. Some people argue that that we need to look at the nature of controls on a platform based on how it is used. So you have a platform which is end-to-end encrypted because you want to protect the privacy of communication between individuals, right? However, if the platform is reinvented in some sense by usage. Almost so through WhatsApp groups, what you have is you have groups which are used primarily as broadcasting mediums, so to speak. You have groups of a large number of people, and they are used primarily to disseminate information as opposed to use as a mode of communication. So one of the proposals that some people make is that we need to take, there needs to be a threshold beyond which perhaps we need to rethink the end-to-end encrypted mode. That position, while worth looking at, has a lot of pitfalls. Where do you draw that threshold? And then do you get into a slippery slope of more and more government demand on removing end-to-end encryption?
There is a question. There's a question. Meanwhile, Amber, there is a question from Kritika saying, can the police be used for fact-checking? Surely this becomes at times a policing issue, because much of this information, this distortion, is close to criminal, or it is criminal enough at least to be inciting a degree of unrest, which is potentially criminal. And under the Indian Penal Code, there are many sections that will make such expression actionable. So is there something the police can do?
There is a major question of capacity there. The police in different states in India, for instance, has tried various things. For instance, if I remember correctly, in the state of Maharashtra, in certain districts, they even went to the extent of asking as many police officers to join as many WhatsApp groups as they could, and to try to track misinformation and respond to them in some sense. Again, those are impractical solutions because they don't really scale up. And at the police level also, you need capacity of various kinds. You need technological capacity. You also need capacity around how to respond to situations of that nature. But before we get to law enforcement, I think what we need to also question is within the technical infrastructure of WhatsApp, what more can WhatsApp do to help other actors, help actors like law enforcement, and even, for instance, a public health authority in the case of a pandemic, right? So the issue that we're facing here is that of end-to-end encryption. But most of the misinformation that you see in a country like India is in some manner of multimedia format, right? It's not really written down, it's image, it's video. And there is usually a hash that accompanies content in that format. So even while retaining end-to-end encryption, if WhatsApp were to really invest its resources and energies into something like that, they could identify specific instances of fake news, hate speech. And then when content travels on the platform which is accompanied by that hash, then you could have various levels of regulation. You could have even things where you have educational videos which the reader will have to see before they see that message, and that introduces some manner of friction before and disincentivizes certain kinds of spread of information. You could even prohibit, if there is clear evidence at your end that this is fake information, it's malicious or it is harmful, then you could prohibit spreading of multimedia content accompanied by that hash also. So even at the platforms level, while retaining end-to-end encryption, there are technological solutions that can be deployed. Right now, we don't see enough sort of will to deploy them. And what kind of technological implications they will have? Obviously, the business model of misinformation will also adapt to it and then try to come up with. So it's going to be an iterative kind of process. But what we can safely say is that platforms are not doing everything they can. They're doing a very small fraction of the efforts that they can employ right now to combat this problem.
Right. Now, there seems to be a case, as you describe, and also in line with the question we have received from Jignesh. Jignesh is suggesting training for people. And of course, you were speaking about much the same thing, that before regulation, education. So in what way really, and this is our last question for the panel, all we have time for, arising from what Jignesh would like to hear. If we are speaking of education, if we are speaking of an awareness we each needs to carry and to build and to find tools to build with, how can we do that here and now? What is it we need to look out for, short of extensive and a very biting research, which we don't have the means to carry out, we don't have the time to carry out, don't have the will to go and learn to do. In simple ways, how can we build our own awareness to filter out misinformation?
Can I just come in on that, Sanjoy? Because I teach a course on detecting disinformation at Ashoka University to my media studies students.
Yes.
And one of the projects they have when they do the course every alternate semester is to actually design a product that will teach media literacy and digital literacy to 10-year-olds, to 5th standard students or 4th standard students. And the reason I say this is because, you know, anybody who's born in the last 20 years is a digital native. I mean, we were born in the analog era. We're analog, but they were born digitally and they'll die digitally, and they live in the digital public sphere. And you're empowering all these people with smartphones and technology without giving them the critical thinking faculties that go in to understanding the power of what that little device is that they hold in their hand. And one way of doing this is to kind of give them that training at the school level, at a very young level, because let's face it, even though children are not supposed to have Instagram and Facebook accounts until a certain age, most parents monitor what they do online and they have those accounts. So the idea that you enter the social media space, you enter the digital public sphere with that literacy in hand. It, you know, teaching it later at college, at university to our parents is one thing, but I think increasingly this is something, I mean, sometimes I feel that even 10 is too old. You need to start them off when they're 3, when their parents give them an iPad so that they'll stop crying, you know.
Yes.
From then on. And there are people, there are educators who are designing these models and these modules. And I really feel that the scalability of something like this in different languages with different cultural contexts is something that that's the way to educate.
Absolutely. In
Just
fact,
to add,
this awareness is built up at the level of the school curriculum. Absolutely. And, you know, you say you are analog, some of us are dinosaurs, but
just to add to what Maya said, she's right. You know, catch them young is the motto, just to let them know. So we have for instance, in News Mobile, we have a young journalist program where we work with some of the leading schools. So we have been doing fact checking as part of that particular training for years now, because we believe that this really helps them when they go to college. Even that has helped them educate their family members, because one of the challenges, especially when it comes from WhatsApp groups, closed Facebook groups, is that a lot of family members, they fall prey to it. You know, I always talk about it. You know, I don't want to generalize it. It's like it happens with my mother-in-law. I call it a mother-in-law phenomena, where she's a member of a lot of groups. So now I can say that has had an impact. A lot of fact checks are being shared through some of these groups, some of the RW groups. In fact, I am referred anytime there is a forward that comes down to the local community RWA group. So I think we have to make an impact wherever we are. The training is something which is essential, and we have to start, whether small, whether big, whether from schools, whether in communities. But this is imperative if we really we have to fight the scourge of misinformation and fake news.
Yes, Kritika, clearly the idea is to catch them young. As Maya was saying, that's a great idea. It really should be in the school curriculum. And as Saurabh was telling us, so in the best of worlds, you should be doing a job other than you're doing. But what are your thoughts?
No, I think I completely agree with whatever has been said till now. I just want to give actually a case study example, which I'm sure most of the panelists are aware of this, but the district collector of Kannur, Mir Muhammad, he started this fake news curriculum, and I'm sorry to use the word fake news, but he started the fake news curriculum for students of class 8 to 12. And that is, I think, where it starts, or probably that is how we will be able to help people analyze any piece of news or any content that they look at, and how they should look at it critically. So I think that is just one thing I wanted to let everybody know, because it's not impossible. It's not like we can't have it in schools, we can't have it in colleges. We have an example of this. So I think that is really important. News literacy will definitely play a role, in my opinion. I think it really will play a role in fighting misinformation and disinformation.
Amber, a last word from you on this. We were speaking about regulation, education, then as Maya says, and as Saurabh says, education at an early age, but maybe not just that, because I mean, we can't wait for another 30 years to then get smart to something else that may come along by then. So what is possible by way of education for the young and the not so young?
I mean, I think Maya and Kritika already covered that in great detail. I don't have anything very intelligent to add with regard to capacity building from a young stage. What I'll add in terms of how to think of holistically think of both educational as well as regulatory aspects is that it is a fast and constantly evolving space. Regulation suffers because technology will always move at a much faster pace, and then regulation often has to catch up. In some senses, it is good because it also allows certain kinds of innovation to happen before regulation can stifle it as well. But with education, perhaps we can attempt to move a little faster. Some of the risks of over-regulation that exists don't exist with educational efforts of capacity building. And I would say that obviously we have to catch people young, but we have to think of different kinds of capacity building needed at both different age groups and as well as in different kinds of stakeholders, right? So in terms of equipping people how to deal with misinformation, that's one aspect of it. And then there are various kinds of tools that you can acclimatize themselves with. But also the other thing, I think at a more high level, what we need to also educate people is that what is the impact of misinformation? What is the impact of weaponized information that you experience online? And even when you may not have the cognitive capacity, the time or the resources to look at every singular piece of information that comes your way and investigate it. But if you're able to find clear patterns, if you're able to understand how the ecosystem works and what it is designed to do to you, then you might be able to develop a more instinctive sense of also how to deal with it and how to guard against certain kinds of manipulation that you will come across. And I think apart from specific tools, apart from specific ways in which we can fact check, I think we also need to pay educational attention towards thinking at a more high level about information that comes your way and how to then sort of accordingly manage your consumption of information.
Yes. So that only leaves me time now to say thank you to everyone who joined this discussion. This to me was certainly educative. And I'm not going to be in a rush to go back to my WhatsApp for the next few minutes at least. But thank you very much for finding the time and for sharing your thoughts. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.